The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls as folks began gathering near the old wooden platform that served as the town's auction block. It was Tuesday, which meant Labor Day in this small Oregon territory. Settlement. Families who needed extra hands for their farms or businesses would come looking for workers, while those desperate enough would offer their children's labor contracts to survive another harsh winter. Martha Henderson stood quietly beside her younger sister Lucy, both girls wearing their cleanest but well-patched dresses. Martha was 15, built strong from years of farm work, with auburn hair braided tightly back and hands already calloused from milking cows and hauling water buckets. Lucy, barely 13, looked thin and fragile next to her older sister, her blonde hair catching the morning light like spun gold. Their father, Thomas Henderson, leaned heavily on his wooden crutch, his left leg still not right after that terrible logging accident 3 months ago. The accident had crushed more than just his leg. It had crushed their family's hopes of making it through winter on their small farm. Without Thomas able to work the lumber camps, they had no money coming in, and their small potato crop wouldn't feed them through the cold months ahead. "Remember what I told you, girls?" Thomas whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Whoever takes your contract, you work hard and make me proud. The money will keep us alive until spring, and then you can come home." Martha nodded, trying to push down the fear growing in her stomach. She had heard stories about some of the people who came to these auctions. Most were decent folk looking for honest help, but others ... Well, a girl had to be careful. She squeezed Lucy's trembling hand and whispered, "Stay close to me." The town square filled up as the morning wore on. Farmers in their work clothes examined the available workers like they might judge livestock at a county fair. Martha noticed how their eyes passed over her quickly, lingering instead on the prettier girls or the stronger-looking boys. She wasn't surprised. At 15, she was already taller than most women in town and built more for work than for looking at. Her mother used to say she had good strong bones, but Martha knew that wasn't what most employers wanted when they could choose. From a line of workers, old Pete Murphy, who ran the general store, acted as the auctioneer. He climbed up onto the wooden platform and called for attention. "All right, folks, let's get started. We got good workers here today, all looking for honest employment. Remember, these are labor contracts, room, board, and agreed wages for the winter season." Martha watched as the first few workers were chosen. Young Billy Watson, just 14 but already strong as a man, got picked up by the Miller family for their grain operation. Pretty Beth Collins, with her golden curls and sweet smile, was quickly claimed by the banker's wife, who needed help with her household and children. One by one, the platform emptied. Martha felt her heart sinking with each passing minute. Lucy had been chosen by the schoolteacher, Mrs. Patterson, who needed help caring for her elderly mother. At least her sister would be safe and well treated. But Martha remained standing on the platform with just a few other workers that nobody seemed to want. The crowd was starting to thin out when a strange quiet fell over the square. People stopped their talking and turned to look down the main street. Martha followed their gaze and felt her breath catch in her throat. Walking toward them was the biggest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broader than a doorframe and arms like tree trunks. His dark hair hung long past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered most of his face. He wore buckskin clothes that had seen many seasons in the wilderness, and a massive hunting knife hung from his belt. This could only be one person, Jeremiah Mackenzie, the mountain man that children whispered about and adults spoke of in hushed tones. Nobody really knew much about Mackenzie. He came down from the high mountains maybe twice a year to trade furs and buy supplies, then disappeared back into the wilderness. Some said he lived like a wild animal. Others claimed he was running from something back east. What everyone agreed on was that he was dangerous, unpredictable, and best left alone. Mackenzie walked straight through the crowd, which parted before him like water. People stepped back and avoided meeting his eyes. Even the dogs seemed to sense something about him and slunk away. He stopped directly in front of the auction platform and looked up at the remaining workers with dark, unreadable eyes. Old Pete cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Mackenzie, didn't expect to see you at our labor auction. These are good workers here, all available for winter contracts. Mackenzie said nothing. His gaze moved slowly across the platform, studying each person carefully. When his eyes reached Martha, she felt like he was looking right through her, seeing things about her that she didn't even know herself. She wanted to look away, but found she couldn't. There was something in his expression, not cruel or threatening, but searching, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. After what felt like forever, Mackenzie raised one massive hand and pointed directly at Martha. When he spoke, his voice was deep and rough, like he didn't use it very often. "I'll take the fat one." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. Fat one? She felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She wasn't fat. She was strong, built for work, but the way he said it made her feel like some kind of animal being chosen for slaughter. The crowd seemed to let out its breath all at once. People began whispering and murmuring among themselves. Nobody had expected the mysterious mountain man to choose anyone, much less make such a blunt, insulting comment. Old Pete stammered, The Henderson girl? Martha Henderson? Mackenzie nodded once, his eyes still fixed on Martha. "Winter contract. I pay double the usual rate." Thomas Henderson hobbled forward, his face a mix of relief and worry. Double the usual rate would be enough to keep their family fed until spring, but sending his daughter into the wilderness with this strange, dangerous man felt like making a deal with the devil. "She's a good worker," Thomas said, his voice shaking slightly. "Strong and reliable. But she's just a girl, and she's never been away from home." Mackenzie finally looked away from Martha to study her father. "Your girl will be safe. I need someone to help care for my sick mother. Women's work. She be fed, housed, and returned to you come spring with every penny of her wages." Martha found her voice at last. "I can speak for myself," she said, louder than she intended. The crowd turned to stare at her, but she kept her eyes on Mackenzie. "If you need help with a sick woman, I can do that. I've cared for sick folks before, but I want to know what I'm agreeing to." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile flickered across Mackenzie's bearded face. "Fair enough, my mother is old and sick. She needs someone to cook, clean, help her with daily tasks. The work is hard but honest. You'll live in my cabin through the winter. I hunt and trap to keep us fed, nothing more, nothing less." Martha looked at her father, seeing the desperate hope in his eyes. She thought about their empty food stores, their unpaid debts, the long cold winter ahead. She thought about Lucy, safe with the kind school teacher, and knew someone had to help their family survive. "I'll do it," she said firmly, and with those 3 words, Martha Henderson's life changed forever. The next morning came too soon for Martha. She woke before dawn in her family's small cabin, listening to the familiar sounds of home one last time, her father's heavy breathing, the old rooster crowing outside, the wind whistling through the gaps in the wooden walls. Everything felt different now, like she was seeing it all through glass, already becoming a memory. She packed her few belongings into a worn cloth bundle. 2 dresses, some undergarments, her mother's old shawl, a small Bible, and the wooden hair comb her grandmother had given her. It wasn't much to show for 15 years of life, but it was all she had to take into whatever waited for her in the mountains. Mackenzie arrived just as the morning mist began to lift. He rode a massive black horse that seemed as wild and untamed as its rider. Behind the horse he led a sturdy pack mule loaded with supplies from town. Martha noticed he moved quietly despite his size, like someone who had learned to walk softly in dangerous places. "You ready?" he asked, his voice cutting through the morning silence. Martha nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her father came out of the cabin, moving slowly on his crutch. For a moment the 2 men just looked at each other, and Martha sensed they were having some kind of conversation without words. "You take care of my girl," Thomas said finally. Mackenzie nodded once. "She be safe." Martha hugged her father goodbye, feeling his thin arms shake around her. "Be strong," he whispered in her ear. "Remember who you are." Then Mackenzie was helping her up onto the pack mule, and they were moving away from everything she had ever known. Martha looked back once to see her father standing in the doorway, growing smaller and smaller until the trees swallowed him up completely. The first few hours of travel passed in silence. Mackenzie rode ahead on his horse, following trails that Martha couldn't even see. The mule seemed to know the way, picking its steps carefully over rocks and fallen logs. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew cooler and thinner, making Martha's chest work harder with each breath. The forest around them was unlike anything Martha had ever experienced. These weren't the familiar oak and maple trees near her home, but towering pines that seemed to stretch up forever, blocking out most of the sky. The silence was different too, not the comfortable quiet of farmland, but something deeper and more complete. It felt like they were the only two people left in the world. By midday, Martha's back ached from the unfamiliar motion of riding, and her legs were stiff from gripping the mule's sides. When Mackenzie finally stopped by a small stream to rest, the animals, she climbed down gratefully, stumbling a bit as her feet hit the ground. "You all right?" Mackenzie asked, the first words he had spoken since they left town. "I'm fine," Martha said quickly, though her voice came out rougher than she intended. She wasn't going to complain on her first day. Mackenzie studied her for a moment, then pulled some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. "Eat something, we got a long way to go yet." The food was tough and salty, nothing like the fresh bread and vegetables she was used to, but Martha was hungrier than she realized. As she chewed, she watched Mackenzie water the animals. His movements were efficient and practiced, like someone who had done this countless times before. "How much farther?" she asked. "2 more days," he replied. "Maybe 3 if the weather turns." 2 more days. Martha felt a flutter of panic in her chest. By then, she would be so deep in the wilderness that finding her way home would be impossible. She would be completely dependent on this strange, silent man who had bought her services with words that still stung. As if reading her thoughts, Mackenzie looked at her directly. "Having second thoughts?" Martha lifted her chin. "No, I gave my word." Something flickered in his dark eyes, approval, maybe, or respect. "Good. My mother doesn't need someone who runs at the first sign of trouble." "Tell me about her," Martha said. "Your mother. What's wrong with her?" Mackenzie was quiet for so long that Martha thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "She's old. Been sick for months now. Can't get around like she used to. She tries to keep house, but—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable with sharing so much. "What kind of sick?" Martha pressed gently. "Weak, tired all the time. Sometimes she forgets things. Sometimes she has trouble breathing." Mackenzie stood up abruptly, as if he had revealed too much. "We should keep moving." The afternoon brought new challenges. The trail grew steeper and narrower, winding through rocky passages that made Martha dizzy to look down. Sometimes the path was so tight that tree branches scraped against her arms and caught in her hair. Her mule seemed unbothered by the dangerous drops, but Martha found herself gripping the saddle horn until her knuckles turned white. When they stopped again near evening, Martha's whole body ached. Mackenzie made camp with quick, practiced movements, building a small fire and setting up a simple shelter using branches and his oiled canvas tarp. Martha tried to help, but she felt clumsy and useless compared to his easy skill in the wilderness. "Sit," he said when she stumbled trying to gather firewood. "Rest yourself." Martha wanted to argue, to prove she could pull her weight, but her legs were shaking with exhaustion. She sat on a fallen log and watched Mackenzie work. Despite his size, he moved with surprising grace, like the forest was his natural home. As darkness fell around them, the wilderness came alive with sounds Martha had never heard before. Strange calls echoed through the trees, and something large crashed through the underbrush nearby, making her jump. "What was that?" she whispered. "Just deer," Mackenzie said calmly, stirring something in a small pot over the fire. "Nothing to worry about." But Martha noticed he kept his rifle close by, and his eyes never stopped scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. She realized how truly alone they were out here, how far from any help or safety. If something happened to Mackenzie, she would be lost in these mountains forever. "You're scared," he observed, not unkindly. Martha wanted to deny it, but something about his direct way of speaking made lies seem pointless. Yes, she admitted. I've never been anywhere like this. Mackenzie handed her a tin cup filled with hot stew. It smelled better than anything had a right to after such a hard day. Fear's not a bad thing in the mountains. Keeps you alive. Just don't let it control you. The stew warmed Martha from the inside out, as she began to feel a little more human. How long have you lived up here? 7 years, Mackenzie said, settling across the fire from her. Since my mother followed me up here after ... He stopped, his jaw tightening. After what? But Mackenzie had gone silent again, staring into the flames with an expression that warned against more questions. Martha finished her stew in silence, wondering what could drive a man to leave civilization behind and what kind of woman would follow her son into such isolation. As the fire burned down to glowing coals, Mackenzie showed her how to wrap herself in blankets to stay warm through the mountain night. Sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be harder than today. Martha lay on the hard ground, listening to the strange sounds of the wilderness and trying not to think about how far she was from everything familiar. Above her, more stars than she had ever seen sparkled through the pine branches. Despite her fear and exhaustion, she found them beautiful. Just before sleep took her, she heard Mackenzie moving quietly around their camp, checking on the animals and making sure their fire was safely banked. Even in this wild place, someone was watching over her. For the first time since leaving home, Martha felt like maybe, just maybe, she was going to be all right. On the third day of their journey, Martha began to smell wood smoke in the thin mountain air. After 2 nights sleeping on the hard ground and eating Mackenzie's simple trail food, the thought of a real roof and a warm meal made her heart race with anticipation. But nothing could have prepared her for what she found when they finally reached Mackenzie's home. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, with a clear mountain stream running nearby. It was larger than Martha had expected, built from thick logs that looked like they could stand for 100 years. Smoke drifted peacefully from the stone chimney, and vegetable gardens stretched along the sunny side of the clearing. But what shocked Martha most was how neat and civilized everything looked. She had expected something rough and wild like the man who lived here. "Mother," Mackenzie called out as they dismounted. "I'm back." The cabin door opened, and Martha got her first look at the woman she would be caring for. Despite Mackenzie's warnings about his mother being sick and frail, the woman who stepped outside moved with dignity and grace. She was small and silver-haired, wearing a simple but well-made dress. Her face was lined with age and illness, but her eyes were bright and intelligent. "Jeremiah," the woman said warmly, then her gaze moved to Martha. "And you must be the young lady who's come to help us?" Martha felt suddenly self-conscious about her travel-stained clothes and messy hair. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Martha Henderson." "I'm Eleanor Mackenzie," the older woman said with a gentle smile. "Please come inside." "You must be exhausted after that long journey." The inside of the cabin surprised Martha even more than the outside. Books lined shelves along every wall, more books than Martha had ever seen in one place. A comfortable sitting area was arranged near the fireplace, with handmade quilts and cushions that spoke of a woman's careful touch. The kitchen area was well organized and spotlessly clean, with herbs hanging from the rafters and preserved foods stored in neat rows. "Sit down, dear," Eleanor said, guiding Martha to a chair near the fire. "Let me make you some real tea. I imagine you're tired of whatever trail coffee my son has been giving you." As Eleanor moved around the kitchen, Martha noticed how the older woman had to stop frequently to catch her breath. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared the tea, and there was a grayish tinge to her skin that spoke of serious illness. But she moved with purpose and warmth, clearly pleased to have another woman in the house. Mackenzie had disappeared outside to tend to the animals, leaving the 2 women alone. Eleanor settled into the chair across from Martha and studied her with kind but searching eyes. "So," Eleanor said, "you've agreed to spend the winter with 2 strangers in the middle of nowhere. That takes courage." Martha felt her cheeks warm. My family needed the money. And your son said you needed help. I do need help, Eleanor admitted. More than I like to admit, but I want you to know that you're not just hired help here. You're our guest, and I hope you'll come to think of this as your home. Thank you, ma'am. Martha looked around at all. The books, are these all yours? Eleanor's eyes lit up. Most of them. I was a schoolteacher back in Boston before I married Jeremir's father. When we moved west, I couldn't bear to leave my books behind. She paused, studying Martha carefully. Can you read, dear? A little, Martha said, feeling embarrassed. My mother taught me some before she died, but we didn't have many books. Well, we certainly have plenty here, Eleanor said with obvious pleasure. I would love to help you improve your reading while you're with us. It gets lonely up here, and I miss having someone to discuss books with. Over the next few days, Martha began to understand the strange household she had joined. Eleanor, despite her illness, was sharp as a tack and full of stories about her life as a teacher and her adventures traveling west. She had followed her son into the mountains 7 years ago when he decided to leave civilization behind, and she clearly had no regrets about that choice. Mackenzie himself remained something of a mystery. He was gentle and attentive with his mother, but still barely spoke to Martha beyond basic politeness. He left early each morning to check his trap lines and hunt for game, returning in the evening with fresh meat or supplies. Martha began to realize that his rough appearance hid a man who was both intelligent and deeply caring. The work Martha had come to do turned out to be both easier and harder than she expected. Eleanor tried to maintain her independence, which meant Martha had to find ways to help without making the proud woman feel useless. She learned to prepare meals that would be easy for Eleanor to digest, to help with washing and dressing without being obvious about it, and to keep the older woman company during the long hours when Mackenzie was away, but it was the books that really changed everything for Martha. Eleanor was a natural teacher, and she seemed to take genuine joy in watching Martha's reading skills improve. They started with simple stories, but soon Martha was tackling more challenging books. In the evenings, after Mackenzie returned and they had shared their simple dinner, Eleanor would read aloud from novels and poetry while Martha mended clothes or prepared the next day's meals. Mackenzie usually sat quietly during these reading sessions, working on trap repairs or cleaning his hunting rifle. Martha began to notice that he was listening carefully to every word, though he never commented or joined the discussion. Sometimes she caught him watching her as she struggled with a difficult passage, and she thought she saw approval in his eyes when she succeeded in understanding something new. The routine of mountain life began to feel natural to Martha. She woke early to start the fire and prepare breakfast, spent her mornings helping Eleanor with household tasks and her afternoon lessons, and used the evenings for heavier work like washing clothes or preserving food. The physical work was hard, but it felt good to be useful and needed. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Martha was reading aloud from a book of poems when she stumbled over a particularly difficult word. She tried several times to pronounce it correctly, growing frustrated with each attempt. Melancholy, Mackenzie said quietly from this corner. It was the first time he had spoken during one of their reading sessions. Martha looked up, surprised. What? The word, it's melancholy, means sad or thoughtful. How did you know that? Martha asked before she could stop herself. Eleanor smiled. My son is better educated than he lets on. Tell her, Jeremir. Mackenzie's face darkened and he stood up abruptly. I'm going to check on the animals. After he left, Eleanor sighed. My son was a doctor once, back east, a very good one. He had to give that up when we came here. Martha stared at the closed door. A doctor? But why would he leave that behind? That's his story to tell if he ever chooses to, Eleanor said gently. But I will say this, he's a good man who's been hurt deeply. He may seem rough around the edges, but he has a kind heart. That night, Martha lay in her small bed thinking about this revelation. Mackenzie, the mysterious mountain man who had chosen her at the labor auction, was actually an educated doctor who had given up everything to live in the wilderness. What could have driven him to such a drastic change? As the days passed, Martha began to see glimpses of the man Mackenzie had once been. When Eleanor had a particularly bad day with her breathing, Martha watched him examine his mother with gentle, skilled hands. When Martha cut herself while preparing vegetables, he cleaned and bandaged the wound with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done such things many times before. But perhaps most surprising was how the three of them began to feel like a real family. Eleanor clearly enjoyed having another woman around, someone to teach and care for. Mackenzie, though still quiet, seemed more relaxed with each passing day. And Martha found herself looking forward to their evenings together, reading and talking by the firelight while the mountain wind whispered through the pine trees outside. For the first time since leaving home, Martha began to wonder if maybe she had found something in these mountains that she hadn't even known she was looking for. The question was whether she would be brave enough to admit it, even to herself. The first snow came early that year, arriving in October with a fury that surprised even Mackenzie. Martha woke one morning to find the world outside transformed into a landscape of white silence. The snow had fallen so heavily during the night that it reached halfway up the cabin windows, and the wind howled through the pine trees like a living thing. "Looks like winter means business this year," Eleanor said from her chair by the fire, wrapped in thick quilts. Her breathing had gotten worse over the past few weeks, and the cold seemed to settle deep in her chest. Mackenzie stood at the window, studying the storm with the serious expression Martha had learned meant trouble. "This is just the beginning," he said grimly. "We're going to be snowed in for months." Martha felt a flutter of panic. Being trapped in the mountains all winter was one thing when it was just an idea, but now it was real. There would be no trips to town, no contact with the outside world, no way to leave even if something went terribly wrong. Over the next few days, the snow kept falling. Mackenzie worked from dawn to dusk, cutting extra firewood and making sure their food stores were properly secured. Martha helped as much as she could, learning to split kindling and stack wood in ways that would keep it dry through the long winter months. "You're getting stronger," Mackenzie observed one afternoon as Martha carried an armload of wood that would have been too heavy for her just a month ago. Martha looked down at her hands, surprised to see how calloused and capable they had become. The soft farm girl who had stood on the auction platform seemed like a different person now. "I guess I am." When the blizzard finally stopped after a week, the silence was so complete it felt like the world had ended. Snow lay 6 feet deep around the cabin, and the familiar landmarks of the clearing had disappeared under smooth white drifts. Martha stared out the window in amazement and growing fear. "How do we get out?" she asked. "We don't," Mackenzie said. "Simply not until spring." The reality of their isolation hit Martha like a physical blow. They were completely cut off from everything and everyone. If Eleanor got sicker, if someone got hurt, if their food ran out, there would be no help coming. They would live or die based on what they had prepared and what they could do for themselves. As if reading her thoughts, Eleanor reached over and patted Martha's hand. "Don't worry, dear. Jaromir has kept us alive up here for 7 winters. He knows what he's doing." But Martha could see the worry in the older woman's eyes, too. This winter felt different, more dangerous somehow. The first real test came 2 weeks later. Martha woke in the middle of the night to a loud cracking sound, followed by a crash that shook the entire cabin. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, as Mackenzie's voice cut through the darkness. "Everyone stay calm." Part of the roof just gave way. Martha threw on her clothes and rushed to the main room, where she found Mackenzie examining a section of the ceiling where snow and broken timbers had collapsed inward. Cold air poured through the hole, and more snow was already starting to drift down onto the floor. "Can you fix it?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with worry. Mackenzie studied the damage, his face grim. "I'll have to. But I can't do it alone in this weather." Martha looked up at the jagged hole in their roof, understanding immediately that this was a matter of life and death. If they couldn't seal the cabin properly, they would all freeze before spring came. "Tell me what to do," she said, for the next 3 days, Martha and Mackenzie worked together in conditions that tested every bit of strength and courage she possessed. While the wind howled outside and fresh snow continued to fall, they patched the roof from inside the cabin. Working by lantern light to secure new timbers and seal the gaps, Martha had never done construction work before. But Mackenzie was a patient teacher when their survival depended on it. He showed her how to hold the boards steady while he nailed them in place, how to pack insulation around the edges, and how to spread the waterproof tar that would keep the weather out. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Martha's hands were soon covered in cuts and splinters, and her shoulders ached from holding heavy timbers over her head for hours at a time. But she never complained and never asked for a break. She could see in Mackenzie's eyes how serious their situation was. Eleanor helped as much as her failing health allowed, keeping hot food and coffee ready for the workers and tending the fire, to make sure their workspace stayed warm enough to function. But Martha could see the effort was taking a toll on the older woman, who grew paler and more breathless with each passing day. On the third night, just as they were putting the finishing touches on their repairs, disaster struck again. Martha was reaching for a tool when her foot slipped on a patch of ice that had formed on the floor. She fell hard, her full weight coming down on the makeshift platform they had built to reach the ceiling. The platform collapsed with a splintering crash, sending Martha tumbling to the floor in a tangle of broken boards and tools. She hit the ground hard and lay still for a moment, stunned and gasping for breath. "Martha!" Eleanor cried out. Mackenzie was beside her in an instant, his large hands moving over her arms and legs with the skilled touch of his medical training. "Can you move your fingers, your toes?" Martha tested each limb carefully. Everything hurt, but nothing seemed broken. "I think I'm all right." "You're bleeding," Mackenzie said, pointing to a gash on her forehead where a piece of wood had struck her dot as he cleaned and bandaged the wound. Martha was struck by how gentle his huge hands could be. This was the man who had been a doctor, she realized. This was who he had been before something drove him to hide in the mountains. "Thank you," she whispered. Their eyes met for a long moment, and Martha saw something shift in his expression. For the first time since she had known him, Mackenzie looked at her not as hired help or even as a friend, but as something more. The moment was broken when Eleanor suddenly doubled over in a fit of coughing that left her gasping for air. Both Martha and Mackenzie rushed to her side, but there was little they could do except help her breathe more easily and keep her warm. "I'm all right," Eleanor insisted when the coughing finally stopped, but they could all see she wasn't. The winter was taking its toll on her, and they were still months away from spring. That night, as Martha lay in her bed listening to Eleanor's labored breathing through the thin cabin walls, she realized how much her life had changed since that day on the auction platform. She was no longer the frightened farm girl who had been chosen by a stranger. She was part of this family now, and she would do whatever it took to keep them all alive through the long winter ahead. The next morning brought fresh challenges. Their water barrel had frozen solid during the night, and Mackenzie had to venture out into the bitter cold to break ice on the stream. Martha took over the household duties completely, cooking meals, tending the fire, and caring for Eleanor, while Mackenzie focused on the outdoor work that kept them supplied with water and firewood. It was hard, lonely work, but Martha found she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. When Eleanor was too weak to eat, Martha coaxed her to take small sips of broth. When the fire threatened to go out during a particularly fierce storm, Martha stayed up all night feeding it wood and keeping the flames alive. And through it all, she noticed Mackenzie watching her with something that looked like admiration. The mountain man who had chosen the fat one was seeing her differently now, and Martha was beginning to see herself differently too. She was stronger than she had ever been, braver than she had thought possible, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly needed and valued. Whatever this winter brought, she would face it with courage. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains that year, creeping in with hesitant sunshine and the musical sound of melting snow dripping from the cabin roof. After months of endless white, Martha felt her heart lift at the sight of brown earth showing through the drifts and the first brave green shoots pushing up through the snow. Eleanor had grown weaker through the winter, spending most of her days in bed now, but her spirits seemed to improve with the warmer weather. She insisted on sitting by the open window to feel the spring breeze on her face and listen to the birds that had returned to the clearing. "I never thought I'd see another spring," she confided to Martha one morning as they watched Mackenzie splitting wood outside. "But here we are." Martha squeezed the older woman's frail hand. "You're stronger than you think." But they both knew the truth that no one wanted to speak aloud. Eleanor was dying, slowly but surely, and all the love and care in the world couldn't change that fact. It was on a warm April day, when the last of the snow was melting into rushing streams, that Martha heard horses approaching the cabin. After months of complete isolation, the sound seemed impossible, like something from a dream. Mackenzie heard it too. Martha watched him grab his rifle and move to the window, his face hard with suspicion. Visitors in the mountains were rare, and they usually meant trouble. "Who is it?" Eleanor asked weakly from her bed through the window. Martha could see 3 men on horseback making their way up the trail to their clearing. Her heart stopped when she recognized the lead rider. It was Sheriff Collins from Cedar Falls, and behind him rode her father Thomas and her sister Lucy. "It's my family," Martha said, her voice barely a whisper. Mackenzie's jaw tightened. "What do they want?" Before Martha could answer, Sheriff Collins was calling out from the yard. "Mackenzie, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Mackenzie stepped outside, rifle still in hand. "State your business, Sheriff." "We've come for the girl," Collins said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "There's been talk in town about the situation up here. People are concerned." Martha's father struggled down from his horse, still favoring his injured leg. "Martha, come out here." "We're taking you home." Martha felt the world spinning around her. Home. The word that had once meant everything to her now felt strange and foreign. This cabin, these people, this life she had built in the mountains, this was home now. What kind of talk? "Mackenzie asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Sheriff Collins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "You know how people are, Mackenzie? A young girl alone up here with a man like you for months. It doesn't look right. A man like me?" Mackenzie's voice was ice cold. "Now don't take offense," Collins said quickly. "But you've got a reputation. People remember why you left town, what happened back east." Martha saw Mackenzie's face go white. Whatever secret he had been hiding, Sheriff Collins knew it and wasn't afraid to use it. "That's enough," Martha said, stepping out of the cabin. All eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of their stares. She knew she looked different now. Stronger, more confident, no longer the frightened farm girl they remembered. "Martha!" Lucy ran to her, throwing her arms around her sister. "We've been so worried. Father's been sick with worry all winter." Martha hugged her sister back, but over Lucy's shoulder, she could see the suspicion in the men's eyes as they looked between her and Mackenzie. She understood what they were thinking, what the whole town was probably saying. "I'm fine," Martha said firmly. "Better than fine. I've been well cared for." "That's what we need to determine," Sheriff Collins said. "We've heard stories, Martha, about you and Mackenzie here, about improper behavior." Martha felt her face burn with anger. "There's been no improper behavior. Mr. Mackenzie is a gentleman, and I've been caring for his sick mother." "His mother?" Thomas looked confused. "Nobody said anything about a mother, because nobody bothered to ask," Mackenzie said grimly. "They just assumed the worst." Martha looked at her father, seeing the doubt and worry in his eyes. "Come inside," she said. "Meet Eleanor. See for yourself what my life has been like here." They followed her into the cabin, where Eleanor lay propped up in her bed, looking pale but dignified. Martha watched her father's expression change as he took in the neat, civilized interior of the cabin, the books lining the walls, the obvious care that had been put into making this a real home. "This is Mrs. Eleanor Mackenzie," Martha said formally. "Jeramir's mother, and the woman I've been caring for all winter." Eleanor studied the visitors with intelligent eyes. "You must be Martha's family," she said in her cultured voice. "She's told me so much about you. Please sit down." Sheriff Collins removed his hat, clearly taken aback by Eleanor's obvious education and refinement. This wasn't what he had expected to find in the wild mountain cabin. "I don't understand," Thomas said slowly. "The stories we heard ... were lies," Eleanor said firmly. "Your daughter has been a blessing to us. She's worked harder than any person should have to, and she's done it with grace and kindness. My son and I are deeply in her debt." Martha watched her father struggle with this new information. She could see him trying to reconcile the stories he had heard with the reality in front of him. "But the impropriety ... the Sheriff Collins began. "What impropriety?" Eleanor's voice carried the authority of a lifetime of teaching. "My son has treated your daughter with nothing but respect. She has had her own room, her own privacy, and my constant supervision. If you're looking for scandal, Sheriff, you won't find it here." Mackenzie, who had been silent through this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Tell them who I really am, Mother." Eleanor looked at her son with sad eyes. "Jeremiah, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Mackenzie turned to face the visitors, his jaw set with determination. "I'm Dr. Jeremiah Mackenzie. I was a practicing physician in Philadelphia until 7 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Martha stared at Mackenzie, finally, understanding the weight of whatever secret he had been carrying. "A doctor?" Thomas said slowly. "I had a practice, a wife, a young son," Mackenzie continued, his voice heavy with old pain. "There was a cholera outbreak. I thought I could save them. I thought my medical knowledge would be enough." His voice broke slightly. "I was wrong. They died while I was treating other patients, trying to save the whole city. When I came home, they were already gone." Martha felt tears spring to her eyes as she finally understood. The mysterious mountain man who had saved her family from starvation was himself a man destroyed by loss, a healer who couldn't heal the people he loved most. "I couldn't practice medicine anymore," Mackenzie said. "Couldn't stand to look at sick people and know I might fail them the way I failed my own family. So I came here to the mountains where I couldn't hurt anyone else. And I followed him," Eleanor added quietly, "because a mother doesn't abandon her child, even when that child is a grown man trying to punish himself for something that wasn't his fault." Sheriff Collins looked uncomfortable, clearly realizing that his assumptions about Mackenzie had been completely wrong. This wasn't some dangerous mountain man taking advantage of a young girl. This was a broken man trying to live with unbearable grief. Martha found her voice at last. "He saved our family," she said, looking directly at her father. "When we were desperate and starving, he gave us hope. And he's treated me with nothing but kindness and respect." Thomas studied his daughter's face, seeing the strength and confidence that hadn't been there when she left home. "You look different," he said softly. "I am different," Martha replied. "I'm stronger now. I know who I am and what I'm capable of." "We heard you were being held against your will," Lucy said quietly. Martha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Held against my will?" "I chose to stay." "Even when the winter got so bad we almost died? Even when the roof collapsed and we had to rebuild it ourselves? I chose to stay. This is my home now." The words hung in the air between them, and Martha realized she had just declared something that would change everything. She had chosen these people, this life, over everything she had known before. Sheriff Collins cleared his throat. "Well, if there's no impropriety, then I suppose there's no law being broken." "No law except the one that says a woman can't choose her own path," Martha said firmly. As the visitors prepared to leave, Martha walked outside with her family. The spring air felt fresh and clean, full of possibilities she was just beginning to understand. "Come home with us," Thomas pleaded. "Your room is still there, waiting for you." Martha looked back at the cabin, where Mackenzie stood in the doorway watching them, his face unreadable. "I'm home, Father. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong." After her family left, the cabin felt strangely quiet. Martha went about her daily tasks with mechanical precision, but her mind kept replaying the conversation with her father and sister. The hurt in their eyes when she chose to stay still cut deep into her heart. Eleanor seemed to sense Martha's inner turmoil. "You're having second thoughts," she observed from her bed, where she spent most of her time now. No, Martha said quickly, then paused. Maybe, I don't know. They looked at me like I was a stranger. Perhaps because you are, Eleanor said gently. You're not the same girl who came here last fall. You've grown into a woman who knows her own mind. Mackenzie had been even quieter than usual since the visit. He went about his work with grim determination. But Martha caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was as if he was waiting for her to change her mind and leave. As May turned to June, Eleanor's condition grew worse. The warm weather that had initially seemed to help her was no longer enough to fight the illness consuming her body. She slept more and ate less, and her breathing became increasingly labored. One evening, as Martha was preparing a simple broth that Eleanor might be able to swallow, the older woman called her over to the bedside. "Sit with me, dear," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha settled into the chair beside the bed, taking Eleanor's thin hand in her own. The older woman's skin felt like paper, and Martha could feel how fragile she had become. "I need to tell you something," Eleanor said, "about my son." "You don't have to," Martha began, but Eleanor shook her head. "Yes, I do. Because I won't be here much longer, and there are things you need to understand." Eleanor's eyes, though dimmed by illness, were still sharp and knowing. "Jeremiah has been punishing himself for 7 years for something that wasn't his fault." Martha listened quietly as Eleanor continued. "When the cholera came to Philadelphia, he worked day and night trying to save people. He barely came home, barely slept. He thought he could save everyone if he just worked hard enough. But his wife and son died while he was helping others." "They died because cholera kills, not because he failed them," Eleanor said firmly. "But he's never forgiven himself. He thinks if he hadn't been trying to save strangers, he could have saved his own family." Martha thought about the gentle way Mackenzie had cared for Eleanor, the skill with which he had treated Martha's injuries. "He's still a healer," she said softly. "Yes, he is. But he doesn't believe it anymore." Eleanor gripped Martha's hand with surprising strength. "You've been good for him, Martha. I've watched him change since you came here. He's starting to remember who he used to be. What are you trying to tell me?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "I'm dying, dear. We all know it. And when I'm gone, Jeremiah will try to push you away. He'll convince himself that caring for people only leads to loss and pain." Martha felt tears gathering in her eyes. "But that's not true. Of course it's not. But he's been hurt so deeply that he can't see past his fear." Eleanor's voice was growing weaker. "Don't let him drive you away, Martha. He needs you, even if he won't admit it." That night, Martha lay awake thinking about Eleanor's words. Over the months, she had come to care deeply for both Mackenzie and his mother. What had started as a job to help her family had become something much more precious, a real home, a real family, but it was more than that with Mackenzie. Somewhere along the way, her feelings for the quiet mountain man had grown into something she had never expected. She loved his gentle strength, his hidden kindness, the way he had cared for his mother and protected them, both through the harsh winter. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was in love with Jeremiah Mackenzie. Eleanor's decline happened quickly after that. Within a week, she was too weak to leave her bed. Martha spent her days spooning broth between the older woman's lips and reading aloud from her favorite books. Mackenzie sat by his mother's bedside whenever he wasn't working, holding her hand and speaking to her in low, gentle tones. "I'm not afraid," Eleanor told them one evening as the sun set through the cabin windows. "I've had a good life, full of love and learning, and I've gotten to see my son find happiness again." "Mother," Mackenzie said, his voice thick with emotion. "Take care of each other," Eleanor whispered, looking between Martha and her son. "Promise me." "We promise," Martha said. Squeezing the frail hand in hers, Eleanor died peacefully 3 days later. In the early morning, when the mountain air was cool and birds were just beginning to sing, Martha woke to find Mackenzie sitting beside his mother's still form, tears running silently down his bearded face. "She's gone," he said simply. Martha went to him without thinking, putting her arms around his broad shoulders and holding him as he grieved. For a moment, He leaned into her embrace, accepting the comfort she offered. Then, as if suddenly remembering himself, he pulled away. I need to. There are things to do, he said roughly. Standing up and walking outside, they buried Eleanor on a hill overlooking the cabin, under a tall pine tree that had been her favorite. A traveling preacher happened to be passing through the mountains and agreed to say a few words over the grave. Mackenzie and Martha stood side by side as the simple service was conducted, but Martha could feel the distance growing between them already. After the preacher left, Mackenzie became a stranger again. He spoke to Martha only when necessary, avoided being alone with her, and threw himself into his work with desperate intensity. It was as if he was trying to exhaust himself so completely that he wouldn't have to think or feel. Martha understood what was happening. Just as Eleanor had predicted, Mackenzie was pulling away, protecting himself from the possibility of more loss. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. One evening, about a week after the funeral, Martha found Mackenzie sitting alone by Eleanor's grave. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, and the air was sweet with the scent of wild flowers. She loved this spot, Martha said softly, settling on the ground beside him. Mackenzie nodded but didn't speak. She was worried about you, Martha continued. About what would happen after she was gone. She was right to worry, Mackenzie said bitterly. Everyone I care about dies. Everyone I try to protect gets hurt. That's not true, isn't it? Mackenzie turned to look at her, his eyes full of pain. My wife, my son, now my mother. Everyone I love leaves me. Your mother didn't leave you, Martha said firmly. She died because she was old and sick, not because you failed her. And your wife and son died because of disease, not because you weren't a good enough doctor. Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment. You should go back to your family, he said. Finally, back to town where you'll be safe. Safe from what? From me, from this life. From caring about someone who brings nothing but loss. Martha felt her heart breaking, but she also felt a surge of anger. Don't I get a say in what I want? What you want doesn't matter if it gets you hurt. And what if what I want is to stay? Here, with you? The words hung in the air between them. Mackenzie stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. Martha, he said slowly, you don't understand what you're saying. I understand perfectly. Martha took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I love you, Jeremiah. Not the mountain man, not the mysterious hermit, but you. The gentle doctor who cares for sick people and reads poetry by firelight and grieves so deeply for his family that he ran away from the world. Mackenzie looked stricken. You can't love me. Too late. I already do. For a moment, Martha thought she saw hope flicker in his eyes. Then his face hardened again. It doesn't matter. I won't let you throw your life away on someone like me. Someone like you. Martha stood up, her hands clenched into fists. You mean someone kind and brave and honorable? Someone who saved my family from starvation and treated me with respect when no one else would? Someone who loved his mother enough to follow her into exile and cared for her until her last breath? Someone who fails everyone he tries to protect. Someone who's too scared to try again, Martha shot back. The words hit their mark. Mackenzie flinched as if she had struck him. I'm going to town tomorrow, he said quietly. To arrange for you to go home? And if I refuse to go, then I'll leave instead. Martha stared at him, seeing the determination in his face. He would do it, she realized. Rather than risk caring for her and possibly losing her, he would abandon everything and disappear into the wilderness alone. You're a coward, she said softly. Mackenzie nodded. Yes, I am, and you're better off without me. As Martha walked back to the cabin alone, she felt the weight of Eleanor's final request. Take care of each other, the dying woman had said. But how could Martha take care of someone who was determined to push her away? That night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to fight for a love that Mackenzie was convinced would only bring them both pain. True to his word, Mackenzie set out for town the next morning, leading his horse and the pack mule down the mountain trail. He didn't look back once, and Martha watched from the cabin window until he disappeared into the trees. The silence he Left behind felt deeper than any she had experienced, even during those long winter months when they were snowed in. Martha spent the day cleaning Eleanor's things, carefully packing away the older woman's books and personal belongings. It felt wrong somehow to be handling these precious items while their owner lay so recently buried on the hillside. But keeping busy was the only way Martha could stop herself from thinking about what Mackenzie might be arranging in town. He returned. 3 days later, his face set in hard lines that told Martha everything she needed to know before he spoke a word. "Your father will come for you next week," he said without meeting her eyes. "I've paid him enough to clear his debts and get him through until he can work again." Martha felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You paid him? Like I was something you were returning to a store." "I paid what I owed for your services," Mackenzie said stiffly, "plus extra for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" Martha's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "Is that what this winter meant to you? An inconvenience?" Mackenzie finally looked at her, and Martha saw the pain he was trying so hard to hide. "It meant everything to me. That's why it has to end." Before Martha could respond, they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the cabin. Mackenzie reached for his rifle, but Martha recognized one of the voices calling out from the trail. "That's Reverend Patterson," she said. "From the church?" "In town." Mackenzie's jaw tightened. "What's he doing here?" They soon found out. Reverend Patterson rode into the clearing leading a group of 6 men from town, including Sheriff Collins and several members of the church council. Their faces were stern and purposeful, like men on a righteous mission. "Mr. Mackenzie," Reverend Patterson called out in his booming preacher voice, "we need to speak with you and the young lady." Mackenzie stepped outside, placing himself between the visitors and the cabin door. "State your business, Reverend." "We've come to escort Miss Henderson back to town, where she belongs," Patterson announced. "The decent people of Cedar Falls can no longer stand by while a young woman's reputation is destroyed by improper living arrangements." "What improper arrangements?" Martha demanded, pushing past Mackenzie to confront the group. "I've been caring for a sick woman and maintaining a household. What's improper about honest work?" Council member Robert Hayes, who owned the largest store in town, spoke up with obvious disapproval. "A young, unmarried woman living alone with a man in the wilderness. It's scandalous no matter how you try to dress it up." "The man's mother was present the entire time," Mackenzie said coldly. "The mother who's now dead," Reverend Patterson pointed out. "Leaving you two alone up here, living in sin." Martha felt her face burn with anger. "Living in sin? We haven't done anything wrong." "The appearance of wrongdoing is just as damaging as the act itself," Patterson replied smugly. "Your reputation is already in tatters, girl. The only way to salvage anything is to return to proper society immediately." Sheriff Collins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, Reverend, we don't know that anything inappropriate has happened, don't we?" Hayes sneered. "Look at her. Living like a wild woman up here, probably forgotten every lesson of proper behavior she ever learned." Martha became aware of how she must look to these town men. Her dress was practical and sturdy rather than fashionable. Her hands were calloused from work, and her face was bronzed from mountain sun. She had grown strong and confident, but to their eyes, she probably looked like she had fallen from grace. "There's nothing improper about my behavior," Martha said firmly. "I've worked hard, I've learned to read and write better than most people in your town, and I've proven I can take care of myself." "A woman shouldn't need to take care of herself, Reverend," Patterson declared. "That's what fathers and husbands are for. This mountain hermit has filled your head with unnatural ideas about independence." Mackenzie spoke for the first time since the accusations began. "Miss Henderson is free to make her own choices about where she lives and how she conducts herself." "Not if those choices bring shame on her family and our community," Hayes replied. "We have standards to maintain." "Standards?" Martha laughed bitterly. "Your standards would have let my family starve rather than let me earn an honest living. Your standards judge people by gossip and appearance rather than truth." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had clearly expected to find a frightened, grateful girl ready to be rescued, not a confident woman willing to defend her choices. Reverend Patterson tried a different approach. "Child, you've been isolated up here too long. You've forgotten the importance of reputation, of fitting into proper society. Come back with us and we'll help you remember your place." "My place?" Martha felt her temper flare. "And where exactly is my place, Reverend? Serving in someone else's house for pennies? Marrying whatever man will have me regardless of my feelings? Keeping quiet and grateful for whatever scraps of life I'm allowed?" "A godly woman finds joy in service and submission," Patterson replied piously. "And a godly man minds his own business instead of meddling in other people's lives," Martha shot back. Mackenzie stepped closer to Martha, and she felt some of her anger drain away at his nearness. For a moment they stood together facing the disapproving men, and Martha felt the strength that came from not being alone. But then Mackenzie spoke, and his words shattered everything. "The Reverend is right," he said quietly. "You should go back with them." Martha stared at him in shock. "Jeremiah, no." "You don't belong up here," Mackenzie continued, his voice steady but his eyes avoiding hers. "You belong in town with your own people, living a proper life." "You don't mean that." Mackenzie finally looked at her, and Martha saw the terrible resolve in his face. "I do mean it. This was always temporary. Now it's time for you to go home." Reverend Patterson smiled triumphantly. "You see, even he admits this situation is inappropriate." Martha felt like the ground was falling away beneath her feet. Mackenzie was abandoning her, choosing to side with these narrow-minded men rather than fight for what they had built together. "Fine," she said, her voice cold with hurt and anger. "If that's what you want." "It's what's best for you," Mackenzie said. "Don't you dare tell me what's best for me," Martha snapped. "You're just too scared to admit you might actually care about someone again." The insult hit home. Mackenzie's face went white, but he didn't deny her words. Sheriff Collins cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, if that's settled, we should head back before dark." "I need to pack my things," Martha said stiffly. Inside the cabin, Martha threw her few belongings into her old cloth bundle with angry, jerky movements. Everything she was leaving behind, Eleanor's books, the comfortable life she had built, the man she loved, felt like pieces of her heart being torn away. Mackenzie appeared in the doorway. "Martha, don't," she cut him off. "Just don't." "You've, made your choice. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From being happy? From having a life I actually want?" Martha tied her bundle closed with more force than necessary. "You're not protecting me, Jeremiah. You're destroying us both because you're too frightened to try again." Mackenzie had no answer for that. As Martha prepared to leave the cabin that had become her home, she took one last look around. Everything here told the story of the woman she had become: strong, capable, educated, loved. Now she was supposed to go back to being the desperate farm girl who had stood on the auction platform less than a year ago. "I won't forget," she said quietly as she walked past Mackenzie toward the door. "Even if you want me to, I won't forget what we had here." Outside, the men from town were waiting with obvious impatience. Martha climbed onto the horse they had brought for her, refusing to look back at Mackenzie or the cabin that held so many memories. As they rode away, Reverend Patterson began lecturing her about redemption and proper behavior, but Martha barely heard him. Her mind was focused on the man she was leaving behind, wondering if he would regret his choice or if he was already planning to disappear deeper into the mountains where no one could ever find him again. Either way, Martha knew this wasn't over. Mackenzie might be willing to give up on their love, but she wasn't ready to surrender without a fight. She just needed to figure out how to wage a battle for a man's heart while trapped in a town that wanted nothing more than to make her forget she had ever learned to be strong.